Can you access it again?
Figure out how it works.
Yeah, I think I'll make it easier this time too. I think I can make it easier too. No, that's just that. Tell me, is it streaming?
Yeah, it's doing.
Okay, tell me now. Do you see any changes? Tell me how it goes right now. Is it good?
Yeah, looks fine.
Do you see my face? in the thing?
No, your face.
I mean the camera.
Yeah, I see.
Okay, we're good.
Yeah, make it as big as possible. That'd be.
Doesn't have a stand.
You have to get it close to the wall.
Okay.
What happened to that hijab, for the little girl?
I couldn't coordinate times.
It's the girl.
Your desk.
Yeah, that'll be useful. You can check how you look in the OBS. You can check how you look in the OBS without that. Check just in case. Just so they see you appropriately. Okay. Do you fine with the camera, or would you want to adjust it?
Just it's okay.
I think that should kind of bother me. Yeah. Because they probably don't. How's it look? It is much better than what you said it. You see it? Okay. All you gotta do is go to the PowerPoint.
Yeah. Click it.
Yes, on your set.
It's ready to roll. Huh?
Use what?
Can that be?
Use what? Put them in full screen. This. The PowerPoint.
The PowerPoint. He
Yeah.
can
No,
work.
keep it.
He can work the PowerPoint from the.
Yeah, but it's better to just give it in like this.
Okay.
Can you go full screen?
That is full screen.
No, I think it can go bigger.
You want to do this?
Can you check the screen, make sure everything's correct?
Can we focus it a little bit better?
Yeah, I'll fix that.
Can you move those slides, Shay?
Yeah.
I think it's short.
think that's all. Sure.
Okay.
Okay.
Stream is good?
Yeah.
So we all set?
Hold on. Text to text. It needs to be written.
OBS will not take this one. I think there's something to do. This is treated as a separate window. I got an idea. Let's not do this.
Fine.
Because this is more for the stream. Okay. Oh yeah, this is a lot. Is it this one? Is this one? Yes. Super fine on the screen.
All right.
Very good.
Okay. So we need to start, right?
Stay on the PowerPoint.
Yeah, but we're already screening?
Oh yeah, you're already streaming?
Okay.
We made sure. Okay.
Okay.
All you gotta do is
Okay, we're live then, huh?
you're live and everything's set.
Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala sayyidil mursaleen. Wa ala alihi wa sahabati ajma'in amma ba'd. So, yeah, there's always something missing. So, a microphone for the people. So, alhamdulillah, we've reached to Halaqah 13. We started this last week. And unfortunately, we had a lot of technical difficulties. So we're just going to run through this yesterday because a lot of it actually didn't actually register and it wasn't actually streamed. So we'll just run through this again, what we already went through. Also, we have some new people here that weren't here last time. So we talked about now why is this not? Okay, so we talked about riba, ill thoughts of others, and riba of the heart. So one is that we do riba when we actually talk about somebody with our tongues to somebody else, something that somebody who is not present, something that they would not like us to mention. And this is a terrible thing to do, like eating the flesh of our dead brother or sister, which nobody would like to do. However, there's also a riba we talked about last week, a riba of the heart. So we're not actually expressing something on the tongue, but we're feeling ill thoughts for somebody. So it's like we're doing riba to ourselves, from ourselves, if you will. Okay? So, unsubstantiated ill thoughts for someone, of our Muslim brothers or sisters. And so we mentioned that an ill thought, of course, is su'adhan. Su'adhan, what do we mean by that? A thought which one's heart and mind is inclined towards. And we mentioned also that something which just sort of passes the mind, we're not going to be held accountable for that, but something which comes into the mind and we start thinking about it and harboring that, that becomes a sin. Otherwise, shaitan and nafs will always be whispering to us, ill things, so we have to repel those. And when we repel those things, we actually get reward for that. That's going to be a righteous action. Okay. So we're not permitted to think ill of any Muslim except if it becomes manifest with no other possible explanation. Like some Muslim, goes around killing people, stealing in broad daylight. So we can't come up with some, good explanation for that. So in cases like that, otherwise, whenever it's possible, as far as possible, we try and, give the benefit of the doubt. As they say in the court, you're innocent until proven guilty. Otherwise, our nafs says everybody's guilty until proven innocent. So no. So we always keep, good thoughts for everyone as far as possible. And then we also mentioned that, so suppose some trustworthy person informs you of something of that nature, like, mention something about somebody, for whatever reason. We're going to talk about today the reason or the instances when it's actually permissible and sometimes even, necessary to mention, something like that in various circumstances. So if somebody trustworthy informs you, this is a person who tells the truth, and he mentions something about somebody in whatever context. So, and we have every reason to feel that he's telling us the truth. So then to not believe him would be ill thought of him, So to harbor the ill thoughts for the person who's informing, rather than ill thoughts for the other who he's informing about. So actually, as we mentioned, so ideally we don't want to have ill thoughts for anybody. So we need to think positively for both of them. So what we do, we should actually investigate such circumstances. We don't harbor a thought about anyone until we actually thoroughly investigate and we come to a conclusion without beyond a shadow of a doubt that such and such issue is substantiated. Okay. And as we mentioned, a lot of times people say things about people, and the person might be otherwise trustworthy, but he mentions something about somebody because there's some jealousy, there might be some animosity, and so, so this happens. This also happens among scholars, peers, people who are sort of competing for fame or for position or whatever. So we have to be, cognizant of these factors and these elements when people mention things. Okay. Now, if an ill thought towards a Muslim comes to mind, one should increase one's deference and consideration. Deference, in other words, we get an ill thought and then, maybe we harbored that thought, but then we shouldn't have done that. That's a sin. And so what do I do for that? So I increase my, good thinking of that person. And also, praise this person and make a lot of dua for that person. That's expedition for that, or compensation. Okay? And as we mentioned last time, that this will also cause shaitan to stop, prompting you to do that, because we mentioned, last time, that, you're going to, if you have a shaitan puts in your mind or your heart some ill thought, and now you counteract that by making a lot of dua for him and praising him. So shaitan's never going to come back and mess with you again in that context, because that was harder on him than not doing that. So he would not like you to actually do that. So if we get any ill thought to a Muslim, we should repel it and compensate for it extensively in that way. Okay. So if the slip of a Muslim clearly manifests itself to you, then advise him affectionately and sincerely in private. This is very important. So suppose now it's not a question of ill thought, it's a question of, we know that somebody's doing something wrong. It's very clear. So what do? We, right in front of everybody, just humiliate the person? And no. We seek a time when that person would be in private, where he's not going to be humiliated, where he's not going to feel intimidated. And we mention that with affection, sincerity, with well-wishing. It's not that we're trying to, jump on his case, as it were. We're trying to, move towards a better direction. And so people can sense when somebody is giving me advice, sincerely and in my best wishes. And we can also sense when somebody's just trying to, point out my faults, and one-upmanship type of thing. So when we do come, because it is obviously, it's compulsory to order the right and forbid the wrong, but it's also compulsory to do it in, an appropriate way, in a non-humiliating fashion. Because to humiliate any Muslim, or anyone for that matter necessarily, is a crime as well. And we talked about also that, when we have ill thoughts, and what happens, it starts, it prompts the nafs, to start spying, as we call it, tajassus. And we mentioned in Surah Hujurat that not only the su'ad dhan, inna ba'da dhanni ithm, a lot of ill thought is actually a sin, and also that is what generally leads to tajassus, to spying, probing, trying to weed out and trying to uncover the faults of others, which is a huge crime. And we mentioned that the overall, nature of Sharia is to cover the faults. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is sattar, you know. He covers the faults. He covers all of our faults. Otherwise, if any of us, if our faults were uncovered, then no one would even, stand to look at us, and much less talk with us or deal with us. So we all have faults that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is covering. And so similarly, to take on the characteristics of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, His qualities, that is something which Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam has told us that we should be, keen about, looking after. So, ill thoughts will lead towards spying and probing on a person, and that is, really a serious issue. As the heart will not be content with a mere thought. If we start thinking ill, we want to, find out, we want to see the reality. So it will engage in spying and probing, which is prohibited, as it leads towards removing the cover of a Muslim, as we explained. Whereas if the reality does not manifest it, so you just stop, take that thing out of your mind, don't probe the issue, don't spy, etc. So then what will happen if we don't know the reality and it hasn't become manifest? So that will remain cleaner and clearer in terms of our heart and mind towards the Muslims. Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam used to mention, he says, don't tell me things, about my companions. Don't come and say, he did this, he said that, he did this, he did that. Because I want to go out and meet my companions and meet my people with a clean and pure heart towards everyone. Somebody comes and tells me, hey, he said this, he did this, he's doing that, So all, and somebody is also a human being. So obviously when people say things, it's going to influence anyone, So he was telling them, don't inform me about things like that. So similarly, if we happen to be in a majlis, we happen to be in an area and people are mentioning about things about people, we should, politely and with wisdom and with affection mention that this is really not necessary. Probably we would be much better off discussing other things of relevance rather than sitting and eating the flesh of our brothers and sisters, etc. And you wouldn't say that. That would probably go over well. But you would explain in such a way that we would do well not to be engaged in this type of thing. This is actually not good. And try and influence, people in such a context to move away. So they would enter into a different conversation, not a conversation involving, exposing the faults of others. Okay, so what about the excuses that render ghiba permissible? So can we mention things that people don't like to hear, don't like to have mentioned about them is there any instances? Yes, there are. So what is the general principle? The general principle is this, that mentioning negative attributes of someone is permitted and validated only when a valid Sharia objective, a legal, according to Sharia, objective, cannot be realized except by that. In other words, we can't realize this objective unless we mention this negative thing. For example, in a court of law. So things are going to be mentioned about people that, otherwise should be concealed, or the person would like them to be concealed, but we cannot conceal those things because generally, in this case, rights of others are connected. Okay. So in this is the general principle that this will be permissible when there's a valid Sharia objective that cannot be fulfilled except by the mention of such things. And we'll mention the various instances when this happens. So some of these instances are as follows. For example, oppression, injustice. Somebody is oppressing someone else. Someone is doing injustice to someone else, right? It might be someone, engaged in business. It might be a neighbor. It might be a relative. It might be a spouse. It might be whatever. It might be children or parents or whatever. But there's oppression and injustice, and in this case, other people's rights are being infringed upon. and others are being oppressed and injustice is being inflicted upon them. So to to uh, to stop that oppression or injustice, so if it's necessary to mention such things, then that's okay, right? Similarly, to seek help in changing a munkar. For example, some munkar is going on and some people engage in some wrong things, or some individual or some individuals. And so we seek help from somebody influential that perhaps could, do something to change the situation. من رأى منكم منكرا فليغيره بيده فإن لم يستطيع فبلسانه وإن لم يستطيع فبقلبه وذلك أضعف الإيمان. Who sees munkar from among you, he needs to change it. It's also interesting to understand that usually people say he has to stop it with his hand. That's not what he said. He said he has to change it with his hand. فَلْيُغَيِّرْهُ. Ghayyira means he has to transform it from this wrong munkar into some right virtue, from a vice to a virtue. That's not so easy. It requires a very well thought out strategy, right? So if we just stop something, this is usually what happens. Don't do that. Stop this. Use force. You didn't actually change the munkar. You just put a stop to it momentarily, and superficially. But the person inside has no intention to. Probably the person is just waiting for you to, go away, or when he gets the opportunity, and he'll, as a counteraction to that, probably do it even more. This happens a lot between parents and children. If we don't make the children understand, and educate them, just don't do this and don't do that, then generally, we have the opposite effect. We have what we call radd al-fi'l, an action, prompts a counteraction, so it'll be counterproductive. So if we see something wrong, we are to change it, but we have to actually bring about a change. So if we cannot do that ourselves, and we think that somebody can help us out, for example, so probably we're going to have to mention, we definitely would have to mention what actually is that munkar, and so things of a ghiba nature might be mentioned in that context. But the objective warrants that, because it's about trying to change a munkar. Okay. Istifta, also when we're seeking a legal verdict, go to the mufti and you're asking a fatwa, so obviously he has to know the particulars, right? And so it's best, as mentioned here, alluding to the person rather than identifying. What do you say, mufti, Hadrat al-Mufti, if a person does such and such and such? If you don't have to actually identify the individual. So that's much better, keeping congruent with the whole concept of covering faults of others. Now, if this person needs to be identified because the right cannot be ratified unless or rectified unless that's done, so that's another issue. But if it's possible that we don't have to actually mention the person, then that's going to be better. However, mentioning the person is permissible if it's necessary, and as I mentioned here, let's say the Hind, radiallahu anha, the wife of Abu Sufyan ibn Harb, radiallahu anhu, who were, what we call the Mu'allafa, who accepted Islam after Fath Makkah. So in any case, Hind, apparently she was not getting her nafaqah, she was not getting her expenditures given by the husband, Abu Sufyan. So she went to Rasulullah and she told, Ya Rasulullah, inna Abu Sufyan yani rajulun shahir. He's not generous and he's not giving me my rights. So Nabi listened to that and heard that. And she also asked, can I take, from his property, to the extent that, my expenses are, And so Nabi gave her permission for that. And he also didn't, accost her or reprimand her for taking the name of her husband, because it was necessary, because the expenditure of the husband on the wife is a wajib, and that wasn't happening. And so Nabi did not rebuke her for taking the name of her husband, because it was necessary in this particular istifta, seeking this legal verdict. Okay, so that's another area where that's permissible. Okay, warning Muslims regarding the detriment of someone. Now, this is tricky also. You have to be careful here. So, for example, another Muslim, unfortunately, is, going around, committing acts of fraud. And we know that. Okay, and he's not been reprimanded, he's not being stopped. So, warning people, don't deal with Fulan because he does these kind of things, for example. So, in that case, because, the rights of others or detriment to others, is at stake. So, in that case, this is okay, and perhaps it might be necessary and compulsory, as a matter of fact. Particularly if we know that someone intends to do harm or detriment to somebody else, we must inform them. And if that's so, we take their name and we expose them. So, for example, in belief or in character, for example, somebody has definitely, a skewed belief. That's something that we have a lot these days. We have individuals, who, their aqidah or their belief is distorted or corrupted. And they are also seeking to corrupt the belief of others. So, to even mention that person so that people will not, associate with that person and become affected by his wrong beliefs, this is, not only proper, but it may be absolutely necessary. Now, as I said, we have to be careful here. Why we have to be careful? Because sometimes we'll say in the sake of these objectives, but actually the underlying intention is we have some personal animosity with the person. So we take it as an opportunity to get back at this person. So that's, even though from the outset, or apparently, it seems to be, along these lines, but actually the underlying intention is to take out our vengeance on this individual, humiliate him, which is a very false and improper and sinful intention. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala save us from that. Right? Like if somebody comes to you and says, I really don't like to say this about someone, but I really have to tell you this, that so-and-so is this. So a lot of times, actually, there's no reason that I need to know that. I don't like to say anything about, no, actually, you do like to say it, that's why you're saying it. So we have to be careful. Nafs is a tricky, creation, and shaitan, in prompting and in mentorship, nafs and shaitan are constantly, constantly trying to give us a hard time. Okay, dangerous habits, like we mentioned earlier. Somebody's, going around stealing from people, or somebody's, known for being, fraudulent activities of various types. So no harm in that. Moreover, it may be very much compulsory if we really feel that somebody's going to be affected by that. Okay, advice regarding a marriage proposal. Somebody comes to you and says, hey, so-and-so has proposed marriage to my daughter. And you know that person very well, so what do you say? So if you know that that individual has qualities that might affect and impact, a healthy relationship, a happy marriage, maybe it's got negative qualities that you know about and that individual doesn't know. So you have to tell them about that as discreetly as possible. Okay. Someone known by a nickname. We find this a lot in the science of hadith, and I gave an example among the ruwat, the narrators of hadith. For example, people were known by a nickname, and as we said, don't call people by nicknames, derogatory nicknames, which is a common habit, and in some cultures it's more prolific than in others. So, for example, the lame one, or the blind one, or the defective, whatever. So we have actually individuals like that who were known by those such type of nicknames in hadith. For example, Al-A'raj, which was Sayyidina Abdurrahman ibn Hurmuz, he was among the narrators of Bukhari and Muslim and others. But he was known by this name, Al-A'raj. He used to walk with a limp, because that's in fact probably he was lame, which is not a nice thing to call people generally, Ya A'raj, oh you lame, but he was known by that, and that became sort of the, he was well known by that probably more than by his name. And apparently he didn't have any objection to that, and so he's known by that in the books. So something like that, although it looks like something derogatory, but it's common usage and the person doesn't have an issue with it. So that's also allowed, or the person is only known by that particular nickname. So in that case, it's going to be permissible. Also, someone who openly, shamelessly commits sins and cares less about anybody mentioning it. We have a lot of those like walking around. Where openly, manifestly, committing, heinous sins. So to mention about that is not going to be, in that case, a riba, because the person doesn't care anyway what anybody says about it. In any case, still, it will be, unless there's some purpose for mentioning these things, why do we need to mention it in the first place? It's to do, right? Usually people sit around and just talk about he did this, that, and okay, but don't we have better things to engage ourselves in than that? We would probably do better, looking into our own faults and cleaning them up than, inspecting the faults of everybody on the news and what have you. Okay? Now, suppose we actually commit riba, which probably all of us are guilty of that at one time or another. So what do? So someone committing riba has committed 2 crimes. What are the 2 crimes? Number 1, defiling the rights of Allah. This is a defiling an infringement of the rights of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because Allah has prohibited that. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, mentions that you would not like to eat the flesh, and it's prohibited, obviously. So, what's the expiation? How do we atone for that? Istighfar and tawbah. Because all of the rights that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has upon us, the expiation for any of those is istighfar and tawbah. What is istighfar and tawbah? What's the difference? Istighfar is connected to the past, asking forgiveness for what we did. Tawbah has to do with now and the future. So I'm not going to do this anymore, and I'm sorry about what I did, and I'm not going to do it in the future. So, istighfar and tawbah. Istaghfiru rabbakum thumma tubu ilayh. This is what every Nabi told his people to do. Seek forgiveness for your past sins, and now in the present and the future, cease and desist. Okay, so that's the number 1 infringement. The infringement defiling the rights of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Number 2, we have defiled the rights of the creation also. It's an infringement on the creation. Okay? And that's tougher, because they're going to be tougher on us than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Ghafur Rahim. And the human beings on the day of Qiyamah, they're going to be looking for any possible hasanah that they can acquire, any good deed that they can acquire. As we mentioned earlier, the person of Ghiba is going to be giving away his good deeds until he's expiated on the day of Qiyamah. If his good deeds finish, he'll take on the sins of the person that, he backbit. So, secondly, it is defiling the rights of the creation. So what's the expiation? If the ghiba has reached him, so there's two scenarios. Scenario number 1 is that we, said something about somebody, and actually that's whatever I said reached to that person. He knows that I said that about him. So now what do? So approach that person, go to him, express your remorse, ask him to excuse you, forgive you for that. And that's a hard thing to do. Nafs doesn't like to do that. So it's a kind of humiliation, but that's a kind of humiliation of oneself, by oneself, that, will raise you in the eyes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Who, humiliates himself in front of Allah for the sake of Allah, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will elevate that person. And the opposite is also true. The person who arrogantly elevates himself, in arrogance, and so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will humiliate that person. So, if the person has heard that we said such and such, then we need to go and express, remorse, and to very sorry, that was really wrong what we said, and ask that person to excuse us. Okay. Second, and in that regard also there's a very beautiful hadith. رحم الله عبدا كانت لأخيه عنده مظلمة في أرض أو مال جاءه فاستحله قبل أن يؤخذ وليس ثم دينار ولا درهم إن كانت له حسنات أخذ من حسناته وإن لم تكن له حسنات حملوا عليه من سيئاتهم رواه الترمذي حديث حسن صحيح غريب. So Abu Hurairah narrates that Rasulullah mentioned that may Allah have mercy upon a servant who has wronged his brother in his honor or his wealth. And ghiba would be a defiling of honor. Okay? So, he wronged his brother in his honor or his wealth, it should be or his wealth. Then he comes to him to seek his pattern before his right is taken. In other words, he comes to seek repentance. And he seeks for him to excuse him before that right is taken. In other words, on the day of judgment, when that person will have no dinar and no dirham to pay him. So how will the payment be done? Then if he has any rewards, it will be taken from his rewards. So the person who he did riba to is going to take all of his good actions. He'll take all his rewards. And if he has no rewards and good hasanat, then what he'll do? So he'll take from that person's evil deeds. It will be placed upon him, be levied upon him. So it's very critical that we get that account squared before we leave the world, because the next world is going to be very difficult. So now the second scenario is, suppose the riba has not reached him. Okay, we said something about the nature of the riba, but that actually news of that has not reached that person. So should we also go to him and ask excuse? So that's one approach. One opinion is, or one scenario would be in the second scenario, that you actually go to him still, even though you didn't hear it, and say, look, I said such and such, and so maybe you didn't hear about it, but still, Allah knows, so kindly excuse me, I'm really sorry. There was a fellow that did some riba on me years ago, decades ago, and he was actually a good friend of mine, an associate. And he said something very derogative about me. Later on, he realized that was not right. So in the middle of the night, he actually called me up. He said, Hashim, I have something to tell you. Okay, what? He said, I said such and such about you, and I'm really, really sorry. It's really terrible. And please. I said, okay, yeah, okay, no issue. Now I tell you something. That person, his value, even though he said something about me of the nature of it, but because he was so honest, to himself and took that step, so that person's value in my eyes and his esteem, went from here like up to here. So if we feel that would be the case, then that would probably be the better course of action. However, maybe we would assess the situation, and perhaps it's better off that he doesn't hear about it. Because sometimes say, I said, oh, you did, and so it might, backfire, So therefore, the ulama say in that case, you kind of have to assess the situation. So perhaps it would be more expedient not to tell him, since he doesn't know about it, don't tell him, but how can you expedite that? Rather than seeking his forgiveness, you would seek Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's forgiveness for him. So make a lot of dua for that person, and you can also mention that person, what also they mentioned in expiation of riba. If you have said something, of a riba nature, about somebody, so part of the expiation, the recompense for that and the atonement for that is you go to those people who you said that and say, hey, I said to you guys such and such about so and so. That was totally wrong, and he's not like that, and she's not like that. And actually, that was really, really bad that I said that, and they'll excuse me, and he's not like that. And mention some good qualities about that person. Praise that person, in place of the riba that you actually, committed in his respect. So, Imam Mujahid, one of the great tabi'is, he says, the expiation of eating the flesh of your brother, in other words, backbiting, is to praise him and pray for him for all good things. To all good things you should actually. So you can, as we mentioned, so perhaps you don't have to go and tell him, but ask Allah to forgive you and forgive him as well. Give him ajr for that, and mention him, in praising in the places and in front of the people whom you backbit him, and pray for him as well for all good things, all types of hasanat. And similarly, if the person has died, the person has actually maybe heard it or not, and now he's dead, so there's no way you're going to, go and ask his forgiveness now. But you can take the second course of action, pray for him, and mention him by khair, and so forth and so on. And so that is what we can do for the expiation of, as we say, kafara of ghiba, of that. And that's what we wanted to cover today. صلى الله وسلم وبارك على عبدك ورسولك سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين برحمتك يا رب. So any questions or any comments? No questions? Everything clear?
If you do ghiba for a non-Muslim?
For a non-Muslim. You don't want to do ghiba for anybody.
No, but how do you repent in that case? Like,
Huh?
how do you make up for that?
Well, it would be similar, although it's not as serious, but it's still as serious. You don't want to have bad relations with anybody. But similarly, if you said something of a nature of a ghiba, backbiting to someone who's not Muslim, then similarly, the same thing would hold. You could, go to him and say, hey, I said such and such, and really I'm sorry, that was wrong, and please excuse me. Okay? And if it hasn't reached him, and if you don't want to actually inform him, you can pray for his hidayah. You can't pray for his forgiveness at this point, but you can definitely pray for his guidance, right? Which we should be doing anyway. Yeah? One of my teachers in Makkah, he said one time in class, he said, cursing people is not, an easy thing. That's not something you want to be engaged in. He says, if you never even cursed Satan, your whole life, you're not going to be held accountable. He's already cursed. You don't have to do anything more. So cursing people or mentioning bad things about people, we don't need to be doing that about anyone. Unless, as mentioned, there's specific, shari issues in which we need to actually do that because there's a shari, objective that needs to be fulfilled. Otherwise, why are we going to engage? Why do we need to engage in talking about, the faults of others when we have so many faults ourselves? We should be, engaged in, sorting out our own faults and fixing them. Rahimullah Imran, shaghalat uyubuhu an uyubin nas. Saying in Arabic that may Allah have mercy on that person who his shortcomings have engaged him to the extent that he's oblivious of the shortcomings of other people. Because he sees his own shortcomings, he's so much engaged in trying to get that sorted out. He doesn't see the faults. Is that clear? Wallahu a'lam. Anything else? Subhanakallahumma bihamdika nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta nastaghfiruka wa natubu ilayk.